Hello, Greg. Happy
Hey,
belated Climate Week.
hey, Jonah. I unfortunately had to miss Climate Week this year. I did not fly in and wear a vest and try to pitch you on my climate tech. I, in fact, was in Ottawa instead. I was filling in for the Deputy Commissioner of the NYPD, who was unable to demonstrate their cool new drones at the Invest Ottawa conference. So they called me, given that I was 2 hours away, because as you may have heard, the administration was a bit busy last week. But
A bit busy, but I do think that you're a close stand-in for any sort of NYPD commissioner. It's the resemblance is uncanny.
well, it's true. Being on this podcast is what makes me an expert on drones and things that fly and move and crawl. So thanks for having me on, as always.
But speaking of New York, I mean, we have a very fun and topical guest later on in this episode, Don Miller, Senior Advisor to NYC's Chief Climate Officer, who also previously was Deputy Chief of Staff to the Mayor, and prior to that, led partnerships and policy at Sidewalk Labs Coord. So a lot to talk about with her. Excited to get into that one. But yeah, so much going on this week as well. Like, what else we got on the docket, right? Serve, Deliver Zero, Spirit Halloween, and Uber. Anything else that's exciting for you, Greg?
Oh, well, DoorDash and Zeno. We're talking about electric bodas and all sorts of good stuff. So yeah, it's a good global roundup. Let's get to
All
it.
right, we'll get into it. Real quick, a thank you to our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Pizza Box AI, the all-in-one subscription platform made for pizzerias. With Pizza Box's pizza subscription platform, offer customers a year of weekly pizza and raise up to $200K upfront, interest-free. Secure cash flow and loyalty with customers returning every week. Launch a subscription like Netflix, but tastier. Learn more at www.pizzabox.ai. So, serve, wing, robots, delivery. Where do you want to start, Greg?
Two great tastes that taste great together. I love this. So yeah, if I understand it correctly, Serve and Wing have announced that they are going to do robot to drone delivery. So you take your meal that is cooling every second, you put it in a serve robot, and it trundles its way to a pickup location, and then it flies to where it's
An
going.
autoloader, TM. You got to use the brand terms.
Absolutely, an autoloader. So I mean, as you have noticed, this is basically a demo they cooked up in the parking lot of Wing, if you look at the photos online. And my questions are about, like, number one, where are they going to drop this infrastructure for autoloading? And number two, how do they make sure that the serves aren't intercepted on the way there, which seems to be a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
But I love it here that we're like now trip chaining our food. Like, not just a private taxi for your burrito, not just a private plane for your burrito, but both.
A private transloading for your burrito.
Yes.
But yes,
Private-
companies, if you're pretending that your announcement takes place in Dallas, you got to make sure there aren't any hills in the background. It's got to look like hell on earth. just make it convincing. Yeah, a lot of details TBD on this partnership. They haven't announced which partners it's involving. Serve has not officially launched its service in Dallas yet either for the solely ground-based robotics. So I think more to come, but it's a good buzzword bingo.
It's a fun press release to put out, but it is raising interesting questions about, like, right now it's all sort of like point-to-point robotics delivery. But like, these trip chains will start to form, and like, what will be the vehicle types that make sense? I'm curious to see how it plays out. But yeah, the idea that those autoloaders are going to be dropped into random urban infrastructure so that restaurants will be able to deploy serve robots to Wing loading
Get
spots.
there.
Yeah, this is one of those classic things of like, where do you even procure the urban real estate to put your proprietary infrastructure? Unless we imagine that there'll be public drone pickup points, which weirder things have happened, frankly.
Yeah, and a couple companies are working on those drone post office box for pickup and landing, but it's still a little speculative. I think someone just needs to put, a few $100 million into some sort of duck boat style hybrid vehicle that can fly and crawl and ideally, sink in the Charles River.
Hovercraft's the future.
Hovercraft. Okay, on to the greener side of things. Trying to hit all the topics here. Deliver Zero and Grubhub, new partnership. This one, I think it's a feel-good story, right? Deliver Zero introduces reusable takeout containers to the supply chain. So instead of getting a little plastic single-use thing with your pad thai, it comes in a reusable bowl, you eat it, then it gets cleaned, returned to the restaurant, and reused. So Deliver Zero previously had worked with Uber Eats and DoorDash. Now they got the third one locked up. So I don't know. Something to feel good about, right, Greg?
Interesting. I'm unfamiliar with the exact schematics of it, but I am sort of curious, like how the total carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions of these kinds of partnerships work. Like, is it actually? I mean, I don't know. Obviously, microplastics are a huge concern, and so keeping plastics out of the food chain is a good thing. But yeah, the idea of like cleaning it, picking it up, returning it for this, I don't know. Be curious to see how it plays out versus I don't know, maybe creating more packaging that was somehow reusable at home. But I don't know. But it is a huge source of this. I was just chatting with someone at the International Produce Foundation Association about this, and like packaging is the biggest source of carbon emissions. All those Driscoll plastic containers is a much bigger concern than pesticides or anything else.
I think I was just reading, it was a Wired piece actually saying that on average a reusable packaging needs to be used about 20 times before it kind of cancels out the emissions of a bunch of single serve things, which seems doable. If you think about, your plates and bowls at home, you use them at least 20 times. So a better world is perhaps possible.
Well, Deliver Zero, if you're listening to this, like, let's do the challenge here and like track some of the stuff and see how it plays out. Because I'm very curious to see if consumer habits can be, if they can bend the curve that far.
Yes, Lauren Sweeney, who we had on stage at Curb before this past year, rise to our challenge. But okay, spookier news.
I love it. It's October. We got to do some October content here. Spirit Halloween, which if listeners probably know, like I love the Onion coverage amongst everything else, that like Spirit Halloween is the de facto joke about some institution has fallen apart and now you take over their empty shell, but they have partnered with Uber for on-demand delivery. But the question is, like, Jonah, is like, are they going to deliver my starter pack VC and ad tech bro costumes, or what exactly are they delivering? Like I can now just like order up like a dead president's mask on demand?
I mean, it looks like, from a casual kind of clicking through it, felt like a pretty full list of SKUs that you'd expect in your average, former KB Toys that's now being used for 1 month every year as a Spirit Halloween. But no, I think you're definitely better off with something that's loose fitting, like a VC vest or a Nixon mask, versus if you're trying to do like the sexy skeleton or something form fitting, I'd be worried about not getting to try on the stretchy material beforehand.
That's true. I just love like the directionality of this announcement, in the sense of like, yes, like informality and everything. Like, your dead big box store that's now a Spirit Halloween that pops up, then to supply it to Uber using private vehicles. Like, America, man, we don't build infrastructure or actually build anything for its own intended purpose. We just repurpose things into new and ever more increasingly absurd uses.
Just abstractions, but they're green. But no, maybe it turns out that the real ghost kitchen all along was Spirit Halloween.
Perhaps. Well, the more heartwarming news, I think, at this one, if you go back to heartwarming, I've talked about the big delivery platforms, was DoorDash, which just came out with a piece where basically a report illustrating the preferences of Snap users on the platform. And this really stood out to me because, again, a couple of weeks ago, when I was at the Fast Company Innovation Festival, I had a panel with Danny Dudek, who's government relations for Instacart. And she talked at length about their Snap users as well. And the messages really rhymed, which I thought was interesting. Is that, number one, that basically Snap users are so time crunched and so, just dealing with late capitalism, that the delivery services appeal to them massively. And then number two, the shame that we as Americans place on users of food stamps, as SNAP is most commonly called, they prefer going online as well because they're shielded from the shame of having to do this at checkout. They're able to spend more time and make healthier choices because they don't have to worry about being shamed in public. And I think that's a fairly sad indictment of American culture in general. But yeah, that was an interesting, heartwarming story where both of those platforms are seeing nearly identical behavior.
Yeah. I mean, on one hand, it's sad that anyone would feel shamed for needing government assistance, but it's nice that by disintermediating the humans, you can be shame-free.
Frictionless, baby. Frictionless.
I mean, the internet in general is a shame-free zone, so at least you can finally get some vegetables delivered. Yeah. But I think in general, this week we're being upbeat. We've got lots of good news this week.
We actually do have a bunch of good
something's
news.
Wrong, Greg.
October surprises are coming, Jonah. Don't worry. I mean, we're not talking about the longshoremen. So yeah.
So Zeno just raised $9.5 million to make electric motorbikes, or as they're known in local parlance, bodas, serving East Africa. So if you think about the infrastructure of an East African country, lots of two-stroke dirty motorcycles being used as sort of taxis and delivery vehicles, and basically the sort of workhorse of that part of the world. And it turns out it's not very efficient.
Yes, well, the electrification of two-wheelers is like basically the best thing you can do, globally speaking, from a decarbonization of transport thing. So it was nice to see this announcement. It's a drop there, but it's part of this like larger groundswell. And if you're deep into the weeds on this, and I worked on a report for UNDP, the UN Development Program. A couple things stand out. One, like Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others have documented that like basically China's massively decarbonized transport with a lot of these vehicles. And then two, a number of startups in India and elsewhere are basically coming up with financing mechanisms to help these independent, informal operators who cannot plunk down a couple $1,000 for an electric, motorcycle, can do this. And to me, what really stood out in talking to several of them is interesting is that basically it is a financing problem. You need to basically build your own proprietary credit score for people who do not have formal access to banking and understand who's reliable enough to pay you back for the loans to get that electric vehicle. So if this can help accelerate that, making that access to credit available and bringing the technology in, like this is exactly what you need for like mega cities of sub-Saharan Africa, which is where all urban growth is coming in the next couple of decades, to turn those fleets over as fast as we can.
Yeah, and it's not only an environmental win, but as you sort of alluded to, it's like an economic justice win. You're no longer paying out the nose for gas, but you're using electricity. Zeno has a sort of long-term plan to go Gogoro style with battery swaps, which also solves some of the grid issues since reliability is not great there. So it's heartwarming, and the leadership at Zeno's ex-Tesla. So someone has taken Elon's old mantle of trying to electrify the world and decrease carbon emissions as opposed to making horrifying, ugly trucks.
I'm glad someone's carrying that forward. I would say Tesla's got some good alumni there. Well, speaking of, let's talk about policy a bit more. Governor Newsom, who mostly made headlines for his veto of SB 1047 there on the AI front, has done some good work for the active transportation fans amongst us.
It was legislative season wrapping up, I suppose, but we don't have time to talk about every bill. But this one, SB 960, I think a particularly exciting one. No surprise, it deals with transportation infrastructure. And so basically forcing Caltrans to think about complete streets, which normally they're supposed to have been doing, but they don't often, with roads and quote unquote highways that are Caltrans owned and operated, but run inside of cities. So not true highways kind of off in the middle of nowhere. But a perfect example of this is Santa Monica Boulevard in LA County is nominally it's Highway 2, I think. But for all intents and purposes, it's just like an urban boulevard. But whenever one of the cities that it runs through wants to put in bike lanes or make it nicer, you have to fight with Caltrans. That just, their first and last thought is, level of service. How do we keep sure it's flowing smoothly, which it never is. So ideally, this makes it a little bit easier to, bike and walk and be comfortable when you're not a car.
Oh man, California government, it's really the final frontier and all that sort of stuff. Well, that is good news. They've streamlined out there, but now to just deal with the other infinite amounts of overlapping welter of jurisdictions.
Yes, the jurisdictional fights. But a pickaxe in the right direction.
There you go. All right, well, up from there, Jonah, is the money back? Because yes, we actually have some fundraising news. It feels like, is this 2021? Are we in ZERP again?
Yeah.
I guess we are cutting rates. We are in ZERP again, getting there. But yeah, what do we got?
Well, yeah, we're not quite at ZERP. We're at 5 ERP, it seems like right now. But again, marching towards progress. So the headline for this one was Hungry Panda, which is focused on Asian food delivery, just raised $55 million for their global expansion. They're already in a handful of countries, but this is going to see them continue their worldwide push. The world over, everyone loves Chinese food, everyone loves Japanese food, Korean food. So that's sort of their interesting market, is specializing on certain ethnic cuisines. So it's sort of cool how they've managed to make that like a defensible IP, because obviously you can get lo mein on Uber Eats or DoorDash, but I suppose, one, they're really focused on the internationalization language-wise and maybe going after mom and pop restaurateurs that would be harder for a DoorDash sales representative to get. But I don't know. It also just means if you're hungry for Asian food, if you fire up this app, you know it's going to be there versus filtering and getting a bunch of ghost kitchens and blah, blah, blah. So it's cool that you can still kind of build a new growth brand in this space.
Yeah, I mean that's the part that stood out to me about him too. Is like, is this mean the tide of ghost kitchens is receding? This idea that, like, actually build something that maybe ties into authentic cuisine versus the slop, the original AI generated slop of our time of just like dumping the same fish sandwich or whatever else out there on every platform. But that was there. But I'd say the two things that also stood out for me, the caveats. One is like they're raising 55 million, I believe, at a post money of 500 million. So like, the heady valuations of delivery startups have not returned. And number two, it has been a while, Jonah, since I've seen the phrase use this round for international expansion at a time when we've watched the wave of startups from 2021 doing quick commerce, like crashing and burning and receding. The fact that there is a tide going out, coming in, a tide coming in, a new high tide perhaps rolling in for financing, I thought was very interesting. So best
and
of
a
luck.
couple more to watch for. So if these all come through, it's maybe we really are back, baby. Flink, quick commerce also raising, and then Colombia's Rappi and Delivery Hero's Middle Eastern unit both eyeing IPOs. So if those go to market, then we'll know that we truly are back, baby.
And by we, I mean someone in a different hemisphere than the one that we happen to be operating in here too. Because I think at least the case
global,
of Hungry
Greg.
Panda being London based, what's your access to golf money really is a indicator of everything these days. But all right, well, with the heavy news out of the way, I want to know more about the secret walkable brownstone neighborhood you went to this past weekend. I saw it on Twitter, Zitter, whatever we're calling it these days. And had to look very carefully at the buildings to be like, is this a secret part of downtown LA that I didn't know about?
I Z'd it, yeah. It is, there's, for those that don't know your LA geography, there's actually, I think, 5 secret brownstone neighborhoods that, one is on the Columbia lot, one's on the Paramount lot, one's on the Warner Brothers lot. Like, each studio lot has their own little generic East Coast / Chicago and maybe a tiny bit of London town.
Basically.
Yeah, and they're very convincing. You walk around, you have these nice complete street walls articulated with bricks and brownstone materials and stones. And so for this particular occasion, why was a normie like me on set? It was the LA Times Food Bowl, which was a lot of fun, annual event, sort of brings out the best chefs in LA. And I think, beyond just getting to walk around and look at the fake streets, which was, probably more interesting for me than most people there, you're eating all these amazing, celebrated chefs. You're drinking, quote unquote, in public, which gives it a fun kind of European or New Orleans flair. And it's just very convivial. It's like, oh yeah, like this is sort of how like an urban space could work and does work in many parts of the world. But in this country, you still need a little bit of simulacrum.
Congratulations, Jonah. You just basically described Montreal, so I'm glad you got to experience a little bit of a faux European simulacrum where you get to drink in public. It's pretty great. All right, well, our last item then is, Jonah, you have news of your own. Let's hear your news, your good news.
This is what I was hoping you to read. I don't want to toot my own horn, but no, it's we're about 6 months to go from Herbivore 2025, and the accolades are already rolling in. So you don't know how that's good it's going to be, but we were just named by Industry Dive one of the 9 trade shows to attend in 2025, second year in a row. So we're doing something right. Obviously, a testament more to our great speakers and programming and partners and attendees than me. So not putting that one on the tombstone necessarily, but it's always nice to see what you're working on is making a connection with people. So if folks are ready to join us in 2025, register at herbivore.co.
We will see you there. At least Jonah will. I hope to be there.
Appreciate the support, Greg. But I think with that, let's kick it over to Don Miller. I'm here with Don Miller, Senior Advisor to the Chief Climate Officer for the City of New York. Hey, Don.
Hi, Jonah. How are you?
I'm great. I'm really excited to talk to you today because you have such a cool background. I mean, not trying to flatter you here, but I think you have one of the most interesting CVs that I've seen. A really cool blend of public and private sector experience, starting way back with some great organizations, Urban Institutes, Regional Plan Association, lots of good acronyms, right? TLC, and then jumping to the private side with Coord before going back to the City of New York. So why don't we start with just a little bit of background? How did you become such amazing leader of making cities work better?
Oh, well, that's very flattering, but that is what I try to do. I want to help cities work better. So yeah, as you mentioned, I started my career, doing policy research and data analysis at the Urban Institute, a think tank down in DC. And then while I was in graduate school, I worked at the New York City urban planning nonprofit called the Regional Plan Association. And it wasn't until after grad school that I joined city government, and I'd been kind of sitting in grad school watching and writing all my papers about really a lot of bold policy coming out of the Bloomberg administration, street space work by Jeanette Sadik-Khan, climate policy and congestion pricing advocacy from my current boss, Rit Agrawal, who was also with the Bloomberg administration. There was all this cool public health policy around reducing smoking and unhealthy eating, and it really showed how much of a bold local government can do on these big issues. Yeah. Where I ended up when I did graduate was at the Taxi and Limousine Commission, the TLC you mentioned. And I'd never heard of that agency until I was invited to interview. But I interviewed, I was offered a job, and the rest was history. I worked there for 9 years. I started as a policy analyst and then left as agency chief of staff. It was a fascinating place to work. It's sort of in my mind divided into two eras. There was the kind of pre-Uber and post-Uber era. Pre-Uber, we were doing cool work. We were doing electric taxi pilots way before EVs were commonly ridden, working on wheelchair accessibility. But then, Uber and Lyft came to town, and we had a lot of work to do to sort of manage their introduction and introduce consumer protection and worker
those were some
protection.
contentious years, if I recall.
They were, but it was even before that. It was a dramatic industry. People feel very strongly and emotionally about their transportation. There were always kind of big fish and small fish, and worker management dynamics. So it was certainly contentious, but it wasn't actually such a calm place even before that. But maybe it became more on the national stage once Uber and Lyft came to New York City.
That's a good point. I think it's always been an iconic New York industry with all the sort of colorful characters that tends to entail.
Exactly.
And so then after 9 years with TLC, you jumped over to the private sector side of things, right? With a little company I think many of us might recall named Coord, which was, I think, interesting in its background, right? It sort of started as a Google Sidewalk Labs project before being spun out. So tell us a little bit of the Coord story, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I had gotten interested in this kind of curb space management issue from days at TLC, right? There were real conflicts between vehicles picking up and dropping people off at the curb in taxis, Ubers, Lyfts, and then everybody else trying to get around, especially cyclists and safety issues. And so I started kind of getting interested in that and saw, wow, there are companies that are trying to help cities solve this problem. And Coord had an approach that I felt really comfortable with. I was very interested in moving to a transportation technology sector company, but I was extremely picky about which ones I would be interested in because I had kind of seen a lot of bad behavior that I didn't think was good for the city, right? And so yeah. Coord was somebody that was really, focused on helping cities solve their problems, like through partnering with them. And we did a lot of data collection, but also ran some of the, early pilots where we were telling truck drivers, here's an open loading zone, helping cities begin to price and charge for those loading zones. And it was a really great company. I loved working there. Coord was a software only company, but then actually when we got reabsorbed back into Sidewalk Labs, they coupled us with Pebble, which was that hockey puck sensor.
You're so right. That's totally important that you were on the software side before they glommed back on the hardware. And I suppose in that role, you were leading policy and partnerships. I feel like the policy part, I can see such a clear through line there. Partnerships part, I imagine a little bit more selling to interested cities and transportation planning organizations. How was that switch for you?
Yeah, that was a big change for me. I was used to being on the other side of the table. I think what was helpful for me is I learned, not to kind of just go in and pitch a solution, right? And sometimes, you're at a startup, you think you have such a great solution, you're just ready to go in and say, hi, I have this, it'll solve your problems. But actually, to really start by asking them what their problems are, right? Cities are really diverse in what they're facing and what they're interested in, sort of, we used to call it their curb management journey. And so I think, having come from the other side of the table, that helped me kind of know how to start the conversation with a little bit more of an inquiry and figuring out, is what Coord has to offer for you, right? Right. And spending time with people where it was going to help them solve their city's problems, and finding those right partners. But yeah, it was a big change. I have to admit, I joined and was at the go-to-market stand-up meeting on the first morning, and I said, "Excuse me, but what does go-to-market mean?" And so I learned a lot, but I had great teachers there.
Well, I think it's good to ask. I feel like a lot of people just pretend to know, and then 2 months later, I'd be like, "Oh, I made some serious misunderstandings here." But no, I think you hit on a good point there. Right? There's so many startups that they identify a problem and they think they're the first person to see it, and they come up with a solution. And they think the first person to think of that, and they're just like, "Well, it's so obvious. If we just tell people about it, they'll want to just buy this in droves." And then it's like, "Oh, like they've already tried this," or "Oh, there's all these reasons why that might not work." So I think being humble and being curious can go a long way.
Yeah, it's a good way to start the conversation.
Was there something about that transition from public to private that you thought was particularly telling, or something you would recommend other folks that are thinking about making that switch?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, a lot of my expectations were met in that working on a startup, we were able to make decisions and do things really quickly when it was internal, right? And have, after having spent so long, as part of very large bureaucracies with a lot of set processes and rules, it was like very, very freeing and refreshing to go to a place where, if leadership was on board with an idea, we could just go do it. There was a lot more openness to trying things. And less risk aversion. And so
move a little faster.
Yeah. I mean, and so, of course we were partnering with government, so it's not like we could snap our fingers and roll something out, but, it was kind of a really nice change, I think, to be at an organization where decision-making and action, were faster. And, I got a ton out of it, right? Like, you learn a whole new set of like ways of doing anything, a new bag of tricks that you bring with you wherever you go, and that can help you even if you don't see yourself as forever being in the private sector. If you see yourself as someone who maybe is mostly a public sector person, you still learn so much from being in the private sector about what the strengths of those organizations are, how to work with them, what motivates them. And you can use that to your advantage as a public servant when you are partnering with them, kind of understanding what makes them tick and what they can do that maybe you aren't able to do as government alone.
To that point, maybe you didn't see yourself as a lifetimer in the startup land. So after about 2.5 years, you jumped back to government side. So first, deputy chief of staff to the mayor, and then senior advisor to the chief climate officer, your current role. I wouldn't that first role, maybe for the best not to be worried about that these days. For folks that don't watch the news as closely, the mayor's having a tough week, let's say. But I mean, the current role, there's so many amazing climate focused initiatives going on in the city, right? There's things about greening up freight transport and fleets. There's climate resilience. I mean, yeah, I shouldn't talk. What are you most excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the area of policy I'm most excited about is electric micromobility. I don't think I have to tell your audience about all of the potential it has from sort of not only a climate point of view, but really a quality of life point of view. I don't think most people are riding their kids around in cargo e-bikes to save the earth so much as like that is the most efficient way to live their lives, right? And it has so much potential. But, as it did gain pretty significant adoption in New York City, we're facing all those growing pains, right? We have batteries that are low quality that are catching fire. We have people who are not riding safely and risking themselves and others. And so I spend a lot of time, working with the fire department, working with Department of Transportation to figure out how do we address the growing pains so that this mode can live till its full potential, right? You don't want a really promising technology to be slowed down or knocked back by blowback or by kind of regulatory holes. And so I spend a lot of time working on that, and also on sort of enabling the companies that work in this space, helping them figure out how to navigate our bureaucracy and see where our regulations are preventing things from happening that we want to happen in our city.
And I feel like electric micromobility, to me, sort of almost encompasses three distinct subspaces, right? There's personal owned devices where it's like, hey, I want to buy a e-bike or an electric scooter. Then there's the Birds and Limes of the world, which, for a long time, New York didn't allow them to operate, but in more recent months have allowed them to sort of fill in some of the transit gaps in the outer boroughs. And then the space that I think is maybe the most exciting is fleet-oriented, delivery-oriented, getting couriers onto e-bikes to move your DoorDash, your package. Are you looking at all of those?
Yeah, we are. And, each of those segments has its own challenges. The fleets, right, that's an area where, we don't have a huge problem with those batteries setting on fire if they're a managed fleet like City Bike, Lime, bikes run by Amazon. There it's about how do we drive adoption among the companies that haven't adopted it yet, because truck traffic is a huge pain point in New York City. And so how do we encourage them through both incentives and regulation to make that transition faster for those who aren't doing it yet? Whereas the delivery workers who are working for Uber Eats or DoorDash, it's a completely different set of opportunities and challenges. They have adopted very widely electric micromobility, but their homes are the ones that are most at risk for fire. Some of their riding behavior, we believe, is driven by the financial and time pressure placed on them by the companies. So for each of those segments, it's a very different set of challenges. And to be honest, we're looking at all of them.
Yeah. What are some of the carrots and sticks the city has rolled out in terms of pushing these forward?
Yeah, so one policy I'm working on now that we hope will push forward from sort of the larger scale delivery perspective is something that exists already in California, called an indirect source rule for warehouses. And it's a really, really wonky policy, but basically it's a way that warehouses that are having a significant impact on air quality and quality of life because of their truck operations are given a menu of options to basically mitigate those. And so they can mitigate those through adopting electric trucks. They can mitigate through those by installing air filtration in nearby communities. They can mitigate them. What we're thinking about for New York City is by adopting more sustainable, smaller modes like cargo bikes. And so I'd say that's sort of on the regulatory side of things. On the incentive side of things, our Department of Transportation has had a kind of a program to support the rollout of cargo bikes, incentive programs. We recently changed our regulations to allow for sort of the types of cargo bikes that the companies really wanted to be able to use them efficiently. A lot of them identified kind of some dimensional rules as a barrier for them. And so we worked with industry and safety advocates to try to find the right fit so that we wouldn't be a barrier to their adoption.
Yeah. And I like that, sort of giving them a menu of options versus trying to prescribe just a single thing that might not work for every indirect emission creator.
Yeah, exactly. That's what makes me very excited about the policy too. And it's the type of thing that can really be adapted to different communities' needs. New York City, dense urban environment, the types of solutions that we're trying to incentivize here are going to be different from those in, a bigger, broader landscape like all of Southern California.
Sure. I think speaking of policy, one thing that I've always admired about, New York, the tri-state, it's not afraid to shy away from strong policy. I think it's got like a strong executive leadership style. And so you see all these interesting things around sustainable delivery or the creation of new public spaces. But then sometimes it sort of swings in the other direction, right? Where you might have a certain leader that puts the brakes on congestion pricing at the last second, or turmoil in the mayoral executive office. How do you sort of keep, at the end of the day, the people just working on getting things done, they're just keeping eyes on the ball. How do you keep people focused on just implementing good policy and getting the good work done?
Yeah, I think one of the qualities of almost all of the public servants I work with is just they're there because they're motivated by the mission and the work, right? They're not getting public credit for what they do. They're there because they really care about this thing and find it interesting and cool. And most of them also have a bit of perspective, right? Naturally leadership in government changes. So it's a little built in that, something you've been working on, might get sidelined for a while for some reason, but then things also come back. And so I think people are very committed to the work, and those who've been around a while also realize that there's always bumps in the road. There's a million ways to stop any policy from happening. And so you do have to just be extremely persistent and know, what, this thing is blocked for now, but this might be just the thing that somebody's looking for a year from now. And look, I've done all this work to get it ready. And it's a perspective I think a lot of us who've worked in government for longer can share with people who are newer to it, when things maybe do feel a little more like doomsday, but no, it's things happen, administrations change, priorities change, and have backups, right? You're not just usually working on one thing to solve the climate crisis or transportation in New York City. Usually you have a few things going because it's rarely a straight line from idea inception to realization. Yeah,
very, very true. Last sort of broad, big picture question for you. I think, someone that's works with the public sector, works with the private sector now, has been on the private sector side, working with the public sector. Are there particular things you would recommend to startups or incumbent larger corporations that want to work with the government, especially around accomplishing climate-related goals? Any advice?
Yeah, sure. This is a little bit of weird given your question, but I know how hard it can be in a startup and the pressures that people working at them face. So often there is a very right intention that working with the government as your partner is the way your solution operates at scale and makes the impact that you think it's going to make. But it's very difficult to get in with government. It takes a very long time. And it can take a very long time for a partnership to grow into meaningful revenue. So even if ultimately you want to work with government, it's also good to think about if there are other entities that you can work with on your solution where the barriers aren't quite so high. Does your solution support any private or nonprofit or institutional partners where you can use that to build your product, build your credibility, while you're trying to make headway in government, which is just, it's going to take longer. And then, while you're working with government, I think it is worth, especially startups, looking out for those third-party programs that bring together government and startups. In New York City, we have the Partnership for New York City that runs these with several agencies, New Labs, and other organizations. Creating a new partnership takes a ton of bandwidth for city employees. So these third-party entities can really take on a lot of that overhead and make these things happen more easily they create a structure, right, for it to happen more easily than just sort of a one-off partnership between a startup and government. Another thing I'd think about would be, can you partner with a bigger fish, a larger company, to work with government? Actual like revenue and bigger, longer term partnerships come from requests for proposals, like big formal procurement. Larger companies are much better positioned to respond to those and win them. So if you're a startup and your product's kind of complementary with a larger company, can you partner to be sort of an enhancement of their proposal rather than kind of try to wait around for one that suits your technology individually? And then like the last thing I'll say, and this is like kind of basic, but it bears repeating, is, to be nice.
That's always good advice.
Government workers, they're busy. They're usually trying to do a lot of things at once. They're not really concerned about your Q3 goals that might be nagging at you, but are not their concern.
And there's already plenty of people yelling at them.
There's a lot of yelling. There's definitely a lot of yelling. And I sometimes I see, and most companies that approach government are extremely nice, but I still sometimes see people, I think they're so passionate about their idea that they get kind of a little bit entitled. And that comes through, and just, you need a champion in government, right? So having that empathy and understanding, like probably this person that they're even talking to you is a really strong indicator that they are open to ideas, but they're operating in a very constrained environment. So just having that empathy and patience while also seeing, are there things you can do to make their lives easier? I think will get you a long way, because folks are, extremely, extremely busy. They've got a lot going on, and it's not always easy to kind of bring in a new initiative or partnership.
Sure. Makes total sense. And then I'd say, if anything, to those first 2 points, I feel like I've seen so often the challenge with startups trying to sell government is a lot of governments want to say, hey, like, well, who are your existing customers? Who's done this already? Like, there's a lot of hesitance to be the first mover for good reason. And so if you can point to, oh, well, we've worked with this, nonprofit, or we have this larger organization that we are tied together with, and they've got all these other contracts, I think that can help satisfy some of that. Well, we don't want this to, fall flat and we all look terrible.
Absolutely.
And then being nice is always good advice. So I appreciate that. Well, thank you, Dawn. This was a lot of fun, really informative, and thanks for chatting with us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me and for your interest in our work.